Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. I want to welcome journalists who are here from across the country, and I want to welcome community members from CHIPS communities across the country. We appreciate you being with us. I'm Judith Barish. I am the Coalition Director for CHIPS Communities United. CHIPS Communities United, or CCU, is a national coalition of unions, environmental groups, and community-based organizations. We are working together with local communities to try to make the semiconductor industry equitable and sustainable. We believe that the CHIPS and Science Act ought to benefit communities, local communities, and workers as much as it benefits corporations. So thank you, and thanks to my CCU partners who are on the call. So today we are here from the 4 Intel states, Arizona, Ohio, Oregon, and New Mexico, to send a message to the company. Don't make communities and workers pay for your mismanagement. We haven't seen the financials, which come out tonight, but we know they're not going to be good. Despite Intel's very well publicized financial woes, the company has received the largest federal award under the CHIPS Act, $7.86 billion, plus up to $25 billion in advanced manufacturing tax credits and $3.5 billion from the Pentagon for the Secure Enclave program to make chips for the military. We want to make sure the company fulfills the commitments that it made to the public in exchange for these billions of dollars. And those commitments were detailed in a community impact report that the Commerce Department has released. So far, it's not looking good. For example, Intel committed to create 10,000 manufacturing jobs with CHIPS Act support. But since the time of negotiating the preliminary memorandum of terms with the Commerce Department, the company has announced layoffs of up to 19,000 workers, which have already hit some of our communities hard. Today, you'll hear from some of those communities. And we have speakers from Arizona, from Ohio, from Oregon, and New Mexico, and they're going to be sharing a range of concerns, including air pollution, toxics, labor issues, and corporate accountability. So you can consider today's webinar a community alternative to the company's 2024 financial report. This is our 2024 local impact report. We're asking each speaker to talk for just a few minutes and to share some of their concerns. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A period, and we are inviting questions from reporters for the Q&A period. All questions today will go through the Q&A function of the webinar. So if you have questions that emerge while people are speaking, you can go ahead and enter them now, or you can wait until the end, till the Q&A period itself begins at the end. I'll read them aloud and direct them to the appropriate speaker. If there are journalists on the call who would like to have a more unmediated conversation with any of the speakers, I can put you in touch with them after the call. So, yes, thank you for being here. Our first speaker comes to us from New Mexico, where Intel's Rio Rancho plant has been operating since 1980. And that facility provides a cautionary tale for the other communities around the country. So today I'm introducing Dennis O'Mara, who's co-chair of Clean Air for All Now. Thanks for being here, Dennis.
Thank you, Judith. Clean Air for All Now, or CAFA Now as we call it, is located in Rio Rancho and Corrales, New Mexico, in the northwest portion of the Albuquerque metro area. We're a community-based organization focused on the toxic air emissions of Intel, New Mexico, which began polluting our air here for about 40 years ago. I first began working on these issues in the summer of 2011 when my house began to fill up with Intel's fumes during the very early morning hours as my swamp cooler brought in outside air. My wife and I would wake up with burning nasal passages, throats, and lungs. Over decades, many residents near the plant have complained about upper respiratory and other serious illnesses they attribute to exposure to Intel's emissions. CAFA Now formed in December 2021 in response to Intel's announcement of a $3.5 billion expansion that we were told would increase its emissions. True to their word, and as just one example, according to Intel's own data, between July 1, 2023 and June 30, 2024, Intel's volatile organic compound emissions increased by 163%. We're working to inform and educate the public, and particularly residents living near the Intel plant, about the dangers associated with Intel's chemical emissions, including risks from cancers, cardiovascular disease, and a variety of other illnesses. It's not enough to say that these emissions are dangerous. In various ways, we're trying to make clear how and why they are dangerous, even at so-called permissible concentrations. Recently, for example, we mailed an informational postcard to about 3,200 households near the plant. We are also calling on Intel to revamp its emissions abatement processes and procedures in order to reduce its emissions to an absolute minimum. To that end, we're preparing a document, a draft of which is currently under review, that will say exactly what we believe Intel should do in this regard. In addition, for several years, we've been monitoring the air in the vicinity of the plant for particulates using low-cost monitors. And we're now exploring how we can add more sophisticated equipment to measure selected individual hazardous air pollutants that we believe could only come from Intel. We care about the health and well-being of our community and call upon Intel to implement the most effective emission abatement processes and deliver on the public commitments it's made to improve our environment. For much more information about CAFA Now, visit our website at cafanow.org, cafanow.org. Our mantra for Intel is this: be your own solution to preventing your pollution. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll be happy to participate in further discussions. Questions?
Thank you so much, Dennis. Really appreciate your time and participation. So if New Mexico was sort of our first warning about some of the problems that Intel has brought to local communities, we've also started to see similar things in Oregon. Residents of Oregon who live near Intel's facilities in Aloha and Hillsboro have also faced air pollution problems. When local residents began to understand how emissions from Intel's factories could harm neighbors and school children, they launched a statewide nonprofit and threatened to sue the company and brought Intel to the negotiating table. Today, I'm happy to introduce Molly Tack Hooper, who's an attorney at Earth Justice representing Neighbors for Clean Air on advocacy related to Intel's operations in Oregon. Molly.
Hi there. I was hoping you'd be able to hear from my client today, but unfortunately, Mary Pivoteau, the executive director of Neighbors for Clean Air, had a last-minute conflict. So I will do my best to cover the environmental advocate's perspective on Intel in Oregon. Intel's operations in Oregon are the largest concentration of the company's facilities and talent worldwide. Intel submitted plans to Oregon DEQ for a massive proposed expansion of its 2 semiconductor manufacturing facilities in Washington County, Oregon. And Oregon granted the company a landmark permit that will lead to dramatic increases in air and climate pollution at the Hillsboro and Aloha campuses. These facilities are adjacent to densely packed communities and some of the nation's most pristine farmland. Intel's air quality permit application proposes a 110% increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which would make the 2 Intel facilities the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. The plans also call for sharp increases in particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxide emissions, all pollutants associated with significant public health harm and risk. 15 years ago, my clients, Neighbors for Clean Air and the Northwest Environmental Defense Center discovered that Intel was violating the Federal Clean Air Act by failing to disclose all of its emissions and threatened litigation. They negotiated a good neighbor agreement with Intel designed to provide greater transparency about Intel's emissions and hopefully lead to emissions reductions. But advocates and members of the adjacent communities have been asking for greater transparency in environmental commitments from the company ever since then. As the federal government pours billions from the CHIPS Act into Intel's Oregon facilities, communities in Hillsboro and Aloha have good reason to be concerned about the pollutants that could be generated by these expanded fabs. Only 2 years ago, Intel inadvertently turned off acid gas scrubbers in Oregon for 9 weeks, venting caustic gases into the surrounding neighborhoods. Unfortunately, Intel has provided very little detail to the state regulators or the public regarding what will be emitted once these new CHIPS Act investments are operational. Our clients and partners want to make sure there's greater transparency about the full environmental and human costs of this investment.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's not just neighbors who are concerned about what's happening with Intel's expansion. We're seeing workers who are alarmed too. The company has announced massive global layoffs, up to 15% of its workforce, and warned that further layoffs may be coming. Dylan Wild is an organizer with the United Auto Workers, and he's been speaking with workers at Intel in Chandler, Arizona. And Dylan, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Judith. Yeah, we have serious concerns that Intel's workers are not getting their fair share of the billions in taxpayer dollars that poured into the company under the CHIPS and Science Act. In Arizona, we need good jobs now more than ever for working class families. According to the Morrison Institute at ASU, from April 2019 to April 2023, the median sale price of homes increased by 57%. Every year under this trend, it has become more difficult for first-time homebuyers to achieve the American dream, not to mention the countless other ways workers across the country have been squeezed by the cost of living crisis. In the final announcement of the CHIPS and Science Act award, Intel fails to ensure that $7.86 billion of taxpayer money will create actual good jobs, meaning reliable, family-sustaining union jobs. The announcement says Intel will adhere to the Biden administration's good job principles, but does not specify what that will involve, nor require the company to report publicly on its compliance. Based on the final announcement and community impact report, Intel fails to publicly commit to a minimum number of full-time equivalent jobs to be created or retained, minimum hourly wages to be paid, or minimum hourly benefits to be given. The absence of job creation commitments is problematic given that Intel recently laid off 15% of its global workforce and has already laid off about 2,000 US workers. No company receiving billions in taxpayer money should conduct layoffs or fail to share the benefits with their workers. As is the case in most workplaces, workers at Intel face issues that could be addressed in collective bargaining. Intel, what is your plan to deliver good union jobs to Arizonans and aspiring production workers? We call on Intel to publicly commit to both the good job principles and contract neutrality, to commit to creating good union jobs, workers' right to organize, and high wage and benefit standards. Don't make communities and workers pay for Intel's financial mismanagement.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Really appreciate your perspective. Our next speaker comes to us from a place that doesn't yet have an Intel facility, but where one is being constructed. From the great state of Ohio, I want to introduce Bailey Sandin. She's the Work and Wages Fellow at Policy Matters Ohio. Thanks for being here, Bailey.
Thank you, Judith. Intel has provided some guardrails when it comes to protecting taxpayer dollars, but the lack of transparency is a red flag. The lack of public enforceable benchmarks is concerning because these are ultimately dollars meant to benefit the community. Intel coming to Central Ohio will impact our communities and our statewide economy for generations. However, they are already rolling back on their promises with only completing one fab by 2028 instead of the promised two. That's 3,500 fewer jobs than anticipated. Intel needs to be held accountable so that we can protect Ohioans' valuable tax dollars and our community on all fronts: workforce, environment, and sustainability.
Thanks, Bailey. We've heard from the 4 communities where Intel is investing. Our next speaker brings a national perspective. Lenny Siegel is the executive director of the Center for Public Environmental Oversight. He's also the former mayor of Mountain View, California, in Silicon Valley, where he oversaw cleanup of contaminated Superfund sites that have been polluted by the semiconductor industry. Lenny is a national expert on semiconductor production and toxics, especially PFAS, the toxic forever chemicals. Lenny.
Good morning. Intel's first wafer fab is about a mile from my house, and in the 1970s, like other semiconductor companies, it released trichloroethylene into the groundwater. And we're still trying to clean it up. Could you mute the other speakers? And only a couple of years ago did we learn that they were releasing PFAS into the environment, that they were using PFAS. They're no longer doing wafer fab in Mountain View, but nationally, like other chip makers, they're using hundreds of different forever chemicals, PFAS, in their production. They phased out some of them, but they don't want PFAS regulated as a class, and they won't tell us what we're using. What we know about what they're using comes from studies of wastewater at other semiconductor plants. So Intel's releases of PFAS into wastewater are unmonitored and unregulated, and that needs to change. They say they're going to segregate the chemicals and send them off-site. That means, to me, incineration in a community of color. They're also releasing fluorinated gases into the environment. Those are extremely persistent and potent greenhouse gases. And as far as we know, all they're planning to do to reduce those is to incinerate them. Again, not a solution. In 2023, they released 449,000 metric ton equivalents of fluorinated gases, greenhouse gases into the environment. Intel is run by engineers. If you tell them what to do to clean up their act, they'll do it. But right now, nobody's telling them to clean up their act. We have some information from the CHIPS program office that maybe something will be done, but we're expecting that that'll be retracted under the new administration. So Intel's a polluter, and it's got to be cleaned up.
Thanks, Lenny. Last, but certainly not least, I want to introduce my colleague, Rand Wilson. Back in the 1980s, Rand was a young organizer with the Communication Workers of America, working to help semiconductor workers in Massachusetts' high-tech corridor build unity and gain a voice at work. In the 1990s, Rand worked with the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, which has since morphed, gone global and become the International Campaign for Responsible Technology. They organized in the 90s, they organized a broad coalition that successfully refocused the semiconductor industry's major industrial policy initiative, Semitech, and won federal resources to do research on making chips not just smaller and faster, but safer and cleaner. Today, Rand is strategic advisor at Chips Communities United. Rand, you are muted.
Thanks, Judith. Sorry about that. So today we've heard from each of Intel's host communities loud and clear. We expect Intel to live up to its commitments that it's made to the Commerce Department that's outlined in the Community Impact Report. That report spells out Intel's obligations to create 10,000 good manufacturing jobs, to train local workers, to hire veterans and other historically underrepresented job seekers, and to respect workers' rights and comply with labor law. It spells out that Intel must reduce its toxic air emissions and water pollution and achieve, quote, a net positive water impact, to achieve carbon-free electricity by 2030 and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. We want to know how they're making progress towards those goals. And finally, a commitment to provide affordable childcare and many other important community benefits. Intel is also obligated to regularly report on these goals to the Department of Commerce. We're demanding that Intel report that same information that they give to Commerce to the communities that they are investing in. As key stakeholders in this process, our voices matter too. Intel now finds itself financially struggling, as I'm sure we'll hear about today, but that's due to their poor decisions. So we are saying, don't make us pay for your financial mismanagement. The commitments made to the Commerce Department must be honored. We've heard inspiring stories from activists and organizers in each of the communities who are working to hold Intel accountable. And we're excited to be supporting these local efforts and linking each of these communities where Intel is building or expanding to provide national coordination so that all of us are stronger together. I really want to thank all of the panelists. And Judith, I'm going to turn it back to you for questions from the press.
Great. Thank you very much, Rand. Thanks, everybody. I want we're getting some questions in the Q&A, and I want to ask the panelists to hold off. Don't write your answers. Let's take those live. If we don't get to all of them, then we can figure out another strategy, but I think we can have time to answer them live. So I want to begin with a question from Suzanne Yohannan, who's with Inside EPA, and asks Lenny. Lenny noted that he expected the CHIPS office would likely retract its position on PFAS due to the change administration. Can you expand on what you're referring to? And generally, how do you think the Trump administration might affect Intel's obligations or commitments regarding PFAS and other waste management? Answers.
So, hi, Suzanne. Yesterday at the hearings for Howard Lutnick's confirmation as Secretary of Commerce, Senator Ted Cruz basically laid out the Republican position, which is that the commitments that are made in the Community Impact Report and presumably in the contracts shouldn't be held to because they're just woke and just the liberal Democrats trying to use their power. To me, that signals that the Trump administration, he may even mention childcare as something that shouldn't be required. So we expect them to try to pull back on whatever requirements that they were able to put into the contracts for not only Intel, but the other awardees under the CHIPS Act.
Thanks, Lenny. I'm going to direct this second question to you, Lenny, but if you want to turn it back to me, that's fine. From Jeff Radford, how can Intel be forced to identify content of toxic chemicals it considers proprietary business information?
Well, basically, they're exempted from under their various permits from reporting things because it's confidential business information. And boy, I wrote a book about industry in the 1980s, and one of the chapters was called Trading Secrets. So basically, they claim that things are secret, but they're sharing it with each other. So the environmental regulators can require that the chemical use and releases be reported, but they don't because the companies assert confidential business information. Again, it can be done, but somebody has to take it seriously.
Thanks, Lenny. I'm going to take the next question from Patrick Keck, who asks, what impact would the funding freeze memo from the Trump administration have if it moves forward? So stipulating that I am not an attorney and probably am just speculating as much as any of you can, but what we know is that the Commerce Department has finalized contract awards for 95% of the CHIPS Act money. So those incentives are now, the spending of those incentives are now governed by binding legal contracts. We do not anticipate that there will be major changes in the rollout of those contracts. The companies could sue if there was. As for the last 5% of the money, that money is mostly in a preliminary memorandum of terms or preliminary agreements. The contracts have not been finalized, and we assume that the funding freeze memo from the Trump administration would put a full stop on those efforts, temporarily or permanently, who knows. But beyond that, I think that our speculation is probably as good as yours. I'd be happy to speculate further with you, Patrick, or anybody, if you want to reach out to me, info@chipscommunitiesunited.org.
I think they will seek to revise some of the terms of the contracts where the company and the Trump administration agree.
Yeah, great point, Lenny. The next question is for Molly or Mary, because I saw that Mary Pivoto had joined us, but now maybe she isn't here. So I think I'm going to pass this to Molly. If you are able to tell us, everybody's interested in the air pollution equipment in Oregon being turned off. The way that I've understood it is they didn't notice that it was turned off for about 2 months. So we have a reporter asking, how was that detected? How was it brought to the public's attention? And how quickly did Intel respond?
I hesitate to rely on my memory to answer this. Best, and I can share a link to DEQ's notice of civil penalty assessment that should have some more of those details. Best I can recall, Intel eventually disclosed it, but part of DEQ's fine against Intel involved failing to report all of the permit violations that had accrued over that time that the scrubber was turned off within 15 days, as it is supposed to do. So I will share that letter and decline to characterize the facts any further.
Great, thanks, Molly. I have a couple questions that I wanted to give to the panelists, and then if we don't have any more questions from reporters, then we'll close the webinar, but we're still open for further questions. So, Dylan, I'm wondering what you're hearing from workers in Chandler about their experience as employees of Intel, about, are they worried about layoffs? Are they, what do they feel about their jobs? Like, anything you can share about their experience would, I think, be really helpful for people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. To answer your question, layoffs is the number one issue that we hear from folks. And there's also just a big question as to, like, why is this happening when theoretically all this money is lined up for the company and it's made all of these promises to expand its workforce and to expand development. Workers really want to know what's going on.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Bailey at Policy Matters Ohio, you said you were concerned that Intel wasn't going to live up to the commitments it made to the state of Ohio. Can you say a little bit more about that? Why, what they promised, and how you learned that that's changing, and any details you can give about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that additional question. So, Intel had promised two fab plants to be completed in New Albany by 2028. But what we can see with the first fab plant, its timeline has been grossly pushed back. It only has just recently went vertical at the end of 2024. So now here we are in 2025 with one plant that's not even entirely completed, and it does not seem likely that that second plant is going to be completed within the timeline. That's an issue because the state of Ohio has already allocated dollars to Intel to ensure that they are going to make good on their promises, and they're already rolling them back. And there's also a lack of transparency there where they're not giving us an updated timeline that's realistic for the situation that they're currently in. What we're asking for is increased transparency to ensure that the investment that Ohioans are making into Intel actually pays off.
Thanks so much, Bailey. Dennis, you told us about, neighbors in Rio Rancho and Corrales's concern about air quality. It's been going on for a long time, for decades, right? What kind of response have you gotten from Intel? And please unmute yourself before you answer.
Well, we haven't really confronted them in the past few years about these issues, but essentially what we had been told in the past, and what people who preceded me had been told in the past, is that these issues that the public had brought forth about illnesses and so forth could be coming from and could be caused by a whole host of different sources. And some of them, quite frankly, that had been proposed in the past couple decades ago were ridiculous. Like the local gas station or the local dry cleaner, when they were putting out tens and hundreds of tons of toxic chemicals. So yeah, we haven't gotten a lot of encouragement or positive feedback about that issue from Intel. No.
Thank you. Thank you. Rand, I want to close with a question to you. Intel is in line to receive billions of federal dollars, plus billions more from the 4 states where the company is investing. What should we be say? What's our message for Intel? What should Intel hear from this call today?
The Trump administration may be letting Intel off the hook for those commitments, but we're building powerful coalitions in each of the host communities to hold them accountable. We're going to win those benefits one way or another for the communities that they've invested in and for the tax dollars that U.S. citizens have put up to help make Intel successful and reshore the chip industry.
Thanks, Rand. I said that was the last question. We got one more question for Bailey, a follow-up from Patrick Keck. Ohio's tax credit to Intel holds an estimated value of $475 million. I think that it's more than that. Bailey, you probably have better numbers, but should the state revise its terms if Intel does not create as many jobs as expected?
Yes. And that's the short answer to that, because if Intel is not benefiting community members by providing the good quality jobs that my colleague Dylan has been talking about, then absolutely that's in violation of the contract, it's in violation of agreements, and it's not making good on the commitments and the promises that it's made to Ohioans. If the jobs if it is not producing the jobs that it promised to, then yeah, Ohio should be able to call back those dollars.
Thank you, Bailey. We don't have any other questions. Oh, we've got another question. This is not a question. So I think this is a comment from Doris. Who is part of our coalition, who says to identify PFAS that has not been revealed, citizen activists could test the water near Intel and other sites.
And that's true, but academic studies of wastewater from semiconductor plants show that the majority of the PFAS release are actually what we call dark PFAS, which are not targeted by any of the tests that are commonly used. So there needs to be better testing. Now, the Commerce Department is supporting the development of better testing, but we don't know what's going to happen with that program. It's called PRISM.
Great. I have somebody raising a hand, but I don't think we can take live questions. So if you want to type in your question into the Q&A, we can make time for it. And if not, you can reach out afterwards to me to put you in touch with any of the panelists. So apologies for that, but we can't take live questions in this format. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate your time. Our message to Intel is don't make workers and communities pay for the company's financial mismanagement. We, the public, as taxpayers, both federal, state, and local taxpayers, have committed billions of dollars to the company, and we want to see Intel live up to the commitments it's made to create jobs and to benefit the local communities and the local environment. So many thanks to all of you who are there. My email, again, if people need to be in touch with me, info@chipscommunitiesunited.org. Thank you to our terrific panel from around the country. Really appreciate you. You guys are rock stars. And thank you to reporters and community members for being part of this webinar.